The rain had turned the city above into a slick, reflected neon blur, but down below, on the platform of the 34th Street station, the air was warm, stagnant, and thick with the metallic reek of ozone. It was 3:10 a.m. Marcus stood alone near the edge of the platform, shifting his weight from one tired foot to the other. He had missed his usual train by mere seconds, forced to watch its red taillights fade into the black throat of the tunnel. The digital signboard overhead blinked erratically, its orange LEDs glitching out before displaying a single, static line extreme delay, next arrival 3:15. Marcus leaned against a tiled pillar, tapping his phone screen. No service. He cursed softly, adjusting his backpack. The silence of the station was overwhelming, broken only by the distant, rhythmic dripping of water onto the electrified third rail. Then came a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the soles of his shoes before it could even be heard. A cold gust of air rushed out from the dark tunnel, carrying a faint, sickening odor that made Marcus wrinkle his nose. It smelled sweet, heavy, like copper mixed with rotten fruit. At precisely 3:15 a.m., the train emerged from the darkness. It was completely silent, defying the usual screech of metal wheels against steel tracks. The headlights were not the bright, halogen beams of a standard MTA subway car, but a dim, sickly yellow glow that barely cut through the subterranean fog. As the train rolled to a stop, Marcus noticed something deeply off about its construction. The cars looked ancient, covered in layers of dark grime, yet there was no graffiti, no advertisements, and no visible mechanical couplings between the carriages. The double doors of the car directly in front of him slid open with a soft, wet hiss. Marcus hesitated on the platform. The interior lights flickered continuously, casting long, erratic shadows across the aisle. From where he stood, he could see rows of benches lining the sides of the car. They were wrapped in a pale, textured material that looked unnervingly like leather, complete with subtle, irregular creases and dark stitched seams. He took a step closer, peered into the empty car, and took a deep breath, instantly regretting it. The metallic copper scent was 10 times stronger inside. Knowing that no other train would arrive for hours, Marcus ignored the voice of primal alarm ringing in the back of his head and stepped over the threshold onto the ribbed metal floor. The moment both of his shoes made contact with the interior of the train car, the doors behind him slammed shut with a heavy, deafening thud. He spun around immediately, reaching for the rubber edges of the doors to pull them open. But there were no rubber seals. The metal edges of the doors had fused seamlessly into the frame, as if the entrance had never existed at all. Panicking, Marcus hammered his fists against the thick glass windows, but outside the platform was already blurring into a streaked mess of grey concrete as the train accelerated. With terrifying speed, there were no jolts, no sways, just an impossible, smooth propulsion into a dark, descending tunnel that he knew didn't exist on any transit map. The speedometer displays inside the car were dark, but the air pressure building up in his ears told him they were traveling, far faster than any underground rail system had ever gone. He turned back to face the length of the car, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The interior was long, far longer than it had appeared from the outside. The seats, upon closer inspection in the flickering light, made his skin crawl. The pale material was warm to the touch. He could see tiny, faint pores on the surface, and near the edges, where the material was pulled tight over the metal frames, he spotted distinct faded tattoos, a faded rose, a partial serial number, a jagged scar line. It wasn't leather. It was human skin, preserved, stretched, and sewn together with thick black thread. Before Marcus could scream, a heavy, metallic clanging echoed from the far end of the train car. A heavy steel door covered in dark stains slowly swung open. Out stepped a figure, so tall it was forced to hunch its shoulders beneath the curved ceiling of the subway car. The entity wore a filthy, threadbare conductor's uniform that sagged over its asymmetrical frame. Its hands were long, ending in thick yellowed nails, and its face was hidden beneath the shadow of a peaked cap and a high-collared coat. But as it stepped closer, Marcus saw that where its eyes should have been, there were only empty sunken sockets, and its mouth was a wide, toothless tear across its grey, leathery face. In its left hand, the conductor carried a massive, rusted pair of heavy-duty shears, the blades caked with dark, dried crusts. In its right hand, it held a leather satchel that bulged with unseen contents. The conductor took a step forward, its heavy boots echoing against the floor. The air grew instantly freezing cold, making Marcus's breath form thick white clouds in front of his face. The entity raised its head, turning its hollow sockets directly toward Marcus. When it spoke, the voice did not come from its mouth. It vibrated inside Marcus's own skull, a rasping, wet whisper that grated against his nerves. "Tickets, please," the entity rasped. Marcus backed away until his shoulders pressed against the fused front wall of the car. He reached frantically into his pockets, pulling out his wallet, his cash, his credit cards, his transit pass, tossing them onto the floor between them. "Take it, take everything. Just open the doors," he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer terror. The conductor didn't even look down at the scattered money. It took another slow, deliberate step toward Marcus, the long shears opening and closing with a sharp, mechanical click-clack that rang out like a gunshot in the confined space. "Paper has no value here," the voice echoed in Marcus's mind, cold and devoid of any human emotion. "The fare is paid in living flesh, 1 square inch for every 10 miles traveled. You have already traveled 30 miles into the deep." Marcus looked frantically around the car for any weapon, any exit, but the windows were solid. Impenetrable slabs of thick glass showing nothing outside, but pitch-black void. The train was descending deeper into the earth, the incline steepening so much that he had to brace, his feet against the floor to keep from sliding, toward the oncoming monstrosity. The conductor reached out with one long skeletal arm, its fingers wrapping around Marcus's throat with the crushing force of an iron vise. Marcus struggled, kicking and hitting the creature's chest, but it felt like punching a solid block of frozen wood. "Choose your payment," the conductor whispered, leaning down so close that Marcus could see the tiny, writhing parasites crawling inside the creature's empty eye sockets. "Or the company takes the whole carcass." Pinned against the wall, suffocating under the crushing grip, Marcus felt the icy tip of the rusted shears press firmly against the flesh of his left forearm. The metal was frigid, sending a shock of pain through his nerves before the blades even closed. He realized then with absolute horrifying clarity that there was no rescue coming. No security guards, no fellow passengers, no police. He was trapped inside a rolling slaughterhouse, operating in the forgotten veins of the earth, a victim of a system that demanded a price far higher than any money could pay. The shears tightened. The first snip cut deep into his skin, and Marcus's scream was swallowed, whole by the roaring sound of the train hurtling faster and faster into the infinite, lightless depths below. Next, Story 2 is Begin. The last commuter train of the night rattled along the subterranean tracks, its flickering interior lights casting erratic shadows across the faded vinyl seats. It was far past midnight, and the train was nearly empty, occupied only by a handful of exhausted strangers who paid no attention to one another. Elena sat near the middle of the third car, her eyes heavy as she stared at her own reflection in the dark, smudged window. She was desperate to get home after a grueling 12-hour shift. But as the train sped through the subterranean tunnels, the familiar rhythm of the wheels began to change. Instead of slowing down for her usual stop, the train lurched violently to the left, taking a sharp, unfamiliar turn down an incline that felt far too steep. A high-pitched screech of grinding metal filled the cabin, forcing the remaining passengers to sit up and look around in confusion. Across from Elena, an elderly man wearing a worn trench coat clutched his briefcase tightly, while a young couple near the back doors pulled off their headphones, exchanging nervous glances. The digital display overhead, which usually announced the upcoming stations in bright green text, suddenly went blank before flashing a series of corrupted, unreadable symbols. Elena pulled out her phone, only to see the signal bars drop to 0 instantly. The train was descending deeper than the official transit map ever indicated, plunging down into an ancient, neglected artery of the city's underground network. Without warning, the electric motor sputtered, died, and the overhead lights snapped off, plunging the car into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint red glow of the emergency exit signs. The train coasted to a heavy, shuddering halt with a final hiss of hydraulic brakes. Outside the windows, there was no tiled platform or bright fluorescent lighting. Instead, the dim light revealed a vast, cavernous station built of crumbling, sweat-stained concrete and exposed Soviet-era steel beams. The air that leaked in through the ventilation gaps was cold, damp and thick with the overwhelming stench of stagnant water, rot, and something sickly sweet that made Elena's stomach turn. Before anyone could reach for the emergency release lever, the doors along the entire side of the train slid open simultaneously, with a loud, mechanical groan. A heavy, suffocating silence hung over the dark platform outside. Nobody moved. The few passengers inside, frozen in place, staring out into the pitch-black abyss beyond the threshold. Then a low, wet sound echoed from the shadows of the abandoned platform, the sound of bare feet, slapping against wet concrete, accompanied by a strange, clicking language that sounded entirely non-human. Shadows began to detach themselves from the darkness. Out from the gloom stepped a horde of terrifying figures. They were human in shape, but horribly altered by generations of living in the lightless depths beneath the metropolis. Their skin was translucent and milky white, showing the dark, branching veins beneath. Their eyes were milky, enlarged, and unblinking, reflecting the dim emergency lights of the train like the eyes of nocturnal predators. They wore ragged scraps of clothes, harvested from victims who had vanished into these tunnels over the decades. Panicking, the elderly man leaped from his seat and sprinted toward the open doors, screaming for help as he tried to jump out onto the platform to escape down the tunnel tracks. It was a fatal mistake. The moment his feet touched the concrete of the platform, several pale hands darted out from the darkness with blinding speed. The creatures grabbed him by his arms and legs, hoisting him into the air effortless despite his thrashing. He let out a horrifying shriek as they dragged him violently into the shadows, his screams echoing down the cavernous station before, abruptly cutting off into a terrible, sickening crunch that sent chills straight down Elena's spine. Inside the car, the remaining passengers scrambled backward in pure terror, piling into the far corners of the seating area as far from the open doors as possible. They expected the pale horde to rush into the car and tear them apart, but the creatures did not enter. Instead, a massive, muscular figure stepped into the light of the platform. His body was covered in crude, dark markings carved directly into his pale skin, and around his neck hung a necklace made of human jawbones. He dragged a heavy, rusted meat cleaver along the floor, leaving a long metallic screech in his wake. The leader of the subterranean cannibals looked directly through the glass. At the trapped survivors, a wide, terrifying grin spreading across his face, revealing teeth that had been manually filed down into sharp, jagged points. He raised one pale, clawed hand and pressed it flat against the outside of the glass window, right next to Elena, leaving a greasy, crimson handprint on the glass. He was not trying to break in immediately. He was inspecting them, like a butcher examining cattle through a glass display case. The realization hit Elena like a physical blow. They were completely trapped. The train doors remained wide open, but the platform was a death zone. The creatures surrounding the train were using the dead vehicle as a holding cell, keeping the survivors locked inside where they could be monitored and controlled. The leader gestured to his followers, and 4 of them stepped forward carrying heavy wooden beams, jamming them securely between the train doors and the platform edge to ensure the doors could not be manually forced shut from the inside. They were creating an open stage, and the train car was their front row audience box. 2 pale men stepped out from the darkness, dragging the lifeless body of a young man who had clearly been captured days before. Iron to ice, lost commuter, who had worn a high-end corporate suit, now torn and soaked in dark blood. In complete, terrifying silence, the subterranean tribe set up a makeshift wooden table right in the center of the platform. directly illuminated by the train car's flickering emergency lights. The passengers inside held their breath, some covering their eyes, others paralyzing themselves in sheer horror, unable to look away from the nightmare unfolding just inches beyond the glass. The leader raised his rusted cleaver, and the brutal, methodical butchery began. Every slice of the blade, every splash of blood against the concrete floor, and every sickening sound of bone breaking was fully visible and audible to the terrified captives inside the train. The creatures did not eat like wild animals. They worked with a terrifying industrial precision, skinning and preparing the meat while humming a low, droning chant that resonated through the steel frame of the train car. The tribe members on the platform occasionally turned to face the windows, pointing at specific passengers inside, as if selecting who would be taken next. Elena felt a cold sweat dripping down her back as the leader's pale, milky eyes locked onto hers once again. He smiled, lifted a freshly severed piece from the table, and pressed it against the glass, smearing a thick trail of blood across the window pane, marking her car as the primary source for their next feast. Hours passed like centuries in the subterranean tomb. The humidity inside the sealed car rose rapidly, the air growing heavy with the smell of sweat, fear, and the metallic reek of slaughter coming from outside. The young couple at the back of the car began to weep silently, holding each other tightly, while a young man near the middle aisle began to lose his mind completely, rocking back and forth and whispering frantically to himself. Every time someone tried to move toward the back end of the train to find another way out, the pale watchers lurking on the dark side of the platform would slam their heavy fists against the outer metal hull of the car, reminding them that every inch of the perimeter was heavily guarded. As the first faint vibrations of the city above began to hum through the ceiling, indicating that the morning rush hour was starting miles above them on the surface world, the leader of the Pale Horde stood up from his workspace. He picked up his rusted cleaver, wiped the blade against his leather apron, and walked slowly toward the open door of Elena's car. The rest of the tribe fell completely silent, gathering around the entrance like a pack of starving wolves, waiting for the signal to strike. The leader reached out his pale, blood-stained hand, grabbed the wooden beam holding the door open, and tossed it aside. But instead of entering to claim his next victim, he reached into his belt, pulled out a heavy steel chain, and wrapped it tightly around the door handles, locking the survivors inside the pitch-black car from the outside. He leaned his face close to the gap in the door, his milky eyes staring directly into Elena's eyes through the narrow crack. "Tomorrow night," he rasped in broken, mangled English, his breath carrying the unbearable stench of decay. He tapped the rusted blade of his cleaver against the metal door 3 times with a sharp, echoing rhythm, signaling to the rest of his tribe that the harvest was secured for the coming night. With a series of low, terrifying guttural laughs, the pale creatures slowly melted back into the deep shadows of the abandoned Soviet station, leaving the remaining passengers trapped in the dark, silent train car, listening to the muffled rumble of the innocent world above them, knowing with absolute terrifying certainty that when the sun set again, the platform lights would turn back on for the final act. Thanks for watching.